Hello, everyone. My name is Leslie Slavitt, and I'm the Executive Director of the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy. Welcome to How Has Philanthropy Changed in 30 Years? It's our privilege to have you here today. I already see that people are introducing themselves in the chat. We have folks from Ghana and Mexico, across Michigan I've seen. We encourage everybody to continue to introduce themselves and share a little bit about themselves and where they're from in the chat. In addition, if you have any technical issues, please also note those. The chat will be monitored throughout the webinar. A few quick notes before we begin, just some sort of logistics of the webinar. The first is to note that it is being recorded. The second is I just mentioned, but want to reiterate that any technical difficulties, please note those in the chat and we'll get those right attended to. In addition, at the end of the webinar, we're going to have a Q&A session. And so I encourage everybody to put down questions in the Q&A. Don't wait till the end of the webinar. As something occurs to you, as you have a question, please note it then so we don't lose it and we can try to get to everybody's questions before concluding today's session. In addition, please take notes, but note that slides will be shared. In addition, we ask that everybody fill out an evaluation form that they'll get afterwards to know your experience of the webinar. This is a real special moment for the Johnson Center. We are celebrating 30 years working in and doing translational work within the philanthropic ecosystem. And so it's really our pleasure at this moment in time to reflect on the hard work and the leadership contribution of many individuals who came before us at the Johnson Center, and in particular, those who founded the center. And it's our opportunity to sort of take that origin story, those people who fearlessly believed in the importance of the sector just as it was getting established, to live out those ideas and those issues in the next 30 years. I particularly want to note a very important and trailblazing woman, Dorothy A. Johnson, for whom the center was renamed in 1999. She still is a beacon and a North Star for truly meaningful, engaged practice in the sector, and it's our honor to further her. And you can certainly learn more at johnsoncentre.org. And in addition, we want to talk a little bit more, not just about today, but about the next two webinars in this summer series, which is really the capstone on our 30th year. And we're bringing together experts from the Johnson Center and across the globe to really look at issues that bridge the current, then the past, the present, and the future in philanthropy. And so I will shortly be introducing you to two colleagues for today's webinar. But on August 9th, there will be an international perspective. So building on the Johnson Center's annual 11 Trends in Philanthropy, we'll have colleagues from Canada, Mexico, and Brazil looking from a transnational perspective at philanthropy. In addition, on September 13th, we're going to do something a little bit provocative, and we're going to sort of think about trends for the future. Where will the field be going? And so it's sort of the time capsule. So 30 years from now, folks can look back at us and see how well we understood sort of where the sector was going. So that's going to be a provocative and interesting conversation. We really encourage everybody to join us. So please go to johnsoncentre.org/events to sign up for parts 2 and 3, as well as to see the full calendar of our professional development and courses for nonprofits and foundations. In addition, if you go to johnsoncentre.org and sign up for our emails, you will never miss the news of what's happening at the Johnson Center, and we encourage and welcome all of you to do that. And at this point, it's my great honor to introduce two exceptional Johnson Center colleagues, Dr. Michael Moody, who's the Fry Foundation Chair for Family Philanthropy at the Johnson Center, as well as Jeff Williams, who's Director of the Community Data and Research Lab at the Johnson Center. I think you will find them as thoughtful and smart and insightful as any colleagues in the sector. I know I have, and it's my great pleasure to now turn the webinar over to Jeff.
Thank you, Leslie. Good day, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So in putting this presentation together, we were really fascinated by kind of an overall question, and that is, what was philanthropy like when the center was established in 1992 versus today? History assures us that philanthropy is present even in the darkest periods in our country, but it evolves, it changes over time. And as we celebrate our 3 decades of work, we wanted to look at kind of what were some of those changes that we see. A couple of months ago, Michael Moody authored a wonderful narrative of kind of the story of the period of time, and that's the kind of the second half of our presentation. I wanted to embellish some of the data, so to take a look at some of the numbers and other trends that we see across those 30 years, really look at it from a data perspective. So I put together 6 points to answer the questions of how has philanthropy changed from 1992 to today. So in the next 15 minutes or so, we will dive in, and here's the first point. The number of nonprofits is growing. So one way to take a historical view is to use what's called the IRS Business Master File. That is kind of like the phone book of all registered nonprofits. Now, there are some pauses that we need to make. That Business Master File has some issues. It's current, but the financial information about nonprofits is sometimes, you could argue frequently, stale. It runs a little bit behind. Second, there's a lag from the time a nonprofit starts to the time they get certified as a nonprofit by the IRS, to the time the data is included in the Business Master File. So that's a second issue. And third, who is in the Business Master File and out of the Business Master File has changed over time. So with those caveats in mind, that being said, the Business Master File is the best place to go. So if a senator asked her staff or a member of the public asked a media partner, how many nonprofits are there? The Business Master File is the simplest and easiest way we have to answer that question. Second, the Business Master File is simply, it's the most comprehensive, most consistently published option we have. So just kind of giving you the lay of the land with that good and bad, here's the picture. The number of nonprofits across the last 30 years, you can see has a nice upward trend up and to the right, growing. We are now at about 1.8 million. So our trend line is our long database, and the IRS just released the May 2023 numbers. That's the blue dot that you see. A couple of the jumps in there, the smallest nonprofits, those 990N filers, actually didn't even need to file until 2008. So there's an example about kind of the definition of who's in the Business Master File changing over time, but we've got this nice growth. So the number of nonprofits is growing, ... but we have to go to the next slide to see an interesting caveat. It's growing, but it's growing at about the same rate as the number of small businesses in the United States. So this chart shows the rate of change. In the red is the rate of change year to year of nonprofit registrations, or the total number of nonprofits. In the kind of tealy green, that's the rate of change of the number of small businesses in the United States. You can see for the most part, those lines follow each other very closely. The exception is that big decline. If you look at the teal, that decline right around 2008 to 2010, the Great Recession. So you'll see that decline very sharply in the number of small businesses, and there's a lag to the decline in the number of nonprofits. That lag is not because nonprofits were somehow smarter than the average small business. That lag is because the IRS doesn't decertify a nonprofit until 3 years have passed of no filing. So really, you should see those troughs. That effect of the Great Recession happened at exactly the same time for nonprofits and small businesses. It was a lot sharper for nonprofits, but you'll see the effect in the data is delayed by a couple of years. What we also know is we look at the data, again, just in terms of the number of nonprofits, it varies. The growth rates are very different by the type of nonprofit, human service versus zoo, by the size of nonprofit, big versus small, also by the regions of the country. So we'll have some follow-up data later this fall in a publication kind of to mirror Michael's that really dives into the data about nonprofits, but that's point number one. The number of nonprofits has changed dramatically over that 30-year period of time. Second point, if we look under the hood, the mix of nonprofits is changing. Looking back just over the last 20 years, let's start in the middle. The number of private foundations has remained relatively flat, until very recently when it shot up about 25%. That's kind of hard to see in this picture. For the purposes of this slide, we'll just call it relatively flat over the last 20 years. 501c everything else, meaning not the 501c3s, have declined about 25% across that same period of time. That's the very right-hand side of this picture. Last, this public charities, the left-hand side of this chart, you can see have dramatically increased, about doubled over the last 20 years, from just shy of 750,000 to just about 1.3 million today. Inside of that mix, continuing on the second point, we saw kind of a change of concentration. So nonprofits grew, especially their budgets, but they didn't all grow equally. So on that next slide, we're going to drill down a little bit and show you the income of all public charities from 95 to 2020 that basically more than tripled. But the income of the top 100 public charities didn't triple, it quadrupled. Same thing for the assets. The assets of the largest 100 public charities grew much faster than the assets of all public charities. This is where we start talking about that kind of income inequality or concentration of wealth. We see it in salary data across the United States. We also see it in the kind of the financial characteristics of nonprofits. Just a further push on this, that top 100 public charities, remember 1.8 million public charities in the United States. So those top 100 represent less than 1/100th of 1%. So a very tiny sliver has basically a quarter of those assets. That pattern continues in the third point. The number of private foundations has stayed relatively flat, but their assets are increasing. We're going to linger here for just a little bit. Far right-hand side of this chart, this is if we take all of the almost 100,000 private foundations in the nation and say, what was their average asset balance, kind of that represents almost their endowment, plus buildings and other things, but their total assets, basically it doubled from 2002 to 2020. But look to the far left-hand side of this picture. Look at that median. The median, that point where half of all private foundations have more and half of all private foundations have less, is about $500,000. So kind of if we stopped somebody on the streets in the United States and said, describe a foundation, they would say, oh, it's a nonprofit that has tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in their endowment. And that simply is not the case. More than half of all private foundations have less than $500,000. The 90th percentile is total assets of only 7 million. You don't get to $1 billion foundations until you get to the 99.9th percentile. So again, think back to your middle school math. What do you remember when averages are very different than medians? In this case, when that average is almost 10 or 20 times bigger than the median, it means there are some big whales out there in one of the tails pulling that average away from the median. And that's the situation here. Many, many, many private foundations have total assets, more than 90%, under $8 million. But that last sliver is where a lot of that economic activity is. Now, I want to pause here again. We talked about concentration on the prior slide and say, yes, those largest, the top 1% of private foundations had about 2/3 of all the foundation assets in 2020. And that is essentially unchanged from 20 years before. 20 years before, that figure was 63% of all assets. So yes, concentration is increasing, but it's increasing just a little bit. The largest foundations have always had the majority of private foundation assets in the last 20 or 30 years. That foundation concentration, that kind of growth of financial assets is our fourth point. Across that 30-year period of time, the kind of the giving, the total giving and the power or the share of foundations also increased as a share of total giving. So we have here the sources of charitable donations across the years. You can see in 1992, individuals gave about 80% of all dollars into charitable causes. That fell to about 67% in 2021. Foundations, on the other hand, increased by more than 10%. Their share of total giving grew. So again, this change, that last 20 years was a great time to own stocks and bonds. That's part of what drove private foundations' assets to grow so quickly. They basically, that's their business, is owning an endowment. And so their share of total giving has increased dramatically. Fifth point, that change in foundation giving isn't the only thing that's changed. On the next slide, we'll show there's some other changes. Individual giving, again, has decreased. Foundation giving has greatly increased. And other tools in philanthropy have increased as well. So just like nonprofits have changed, there have been some pretty seismic changes in the behavior of donors over the last 30 years. Mega donors have increased. There's that phrase, donors down, dollars up, which held true at least until last year, that the number of donors is shrinking, but the total value of money into philanthropy, into charity, is growing. Some of those most significant changes have come from increased foundation giving, as we talked about, but also some new tools like charitable LLCs or charitable entities, and some donor advised funds that have really exploded. So let's drill down just a little bit deeper into some patterns of giving, especially with the Giving USA report just coming out in the last few weeks. First, the share of giving to religion has fallen in about half over the last 30 years. However, giving to religious organizations is still the single largest destination of charitable dollars. So even though it's fallen by almost half, or it's gone from about 50 to 25, 26%, it's still the largest single share. And that's important because many individuals learn about charitable giving through donations to religious entities. Giving to religion is actually up about 5% in dollar terms from 2021 to 2022. We prepared this deck literally just as the latest report was coming out, but still it's only 27% of total giving. So still the trend overall, even though religious giving enjoyed kind of a surprise growth over the last year, compared to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's still a smaller share of overall giving. What's not a smaller share of overall giving on the next slide is donor advised funds. Those have really exploded onto the scene. You can see just the last 10 years, a 10-fold increase in the best estimates we have of the number of donor advised funds, and almost a 5-fold increase in the total disbursements. It's so large now that Fidelity Charitable is now the largest public charity in the country, surpassing the United Way, which between the United Way and some of the cancer societies were kind of always in first place over many, many, many years. This is an important kind of nuance to the philanthropic sector. We still don't have a lot of data about DAFs as a whole. It's a lot of arguments by anecdote when we talk about donor advised funds. As researchers and observers of nonprofits and donors and foundations, one of the core tenets of the Johnson Foundation is to think carefully and bring data into these critical discussions. So we're very proud to have authored a groundbreaking study on DAFs a couple years ago. We're even more excited that we've partnered with some other national researchers at universities for the national study on DAFs, which is underway right now. When that data is released later this year, it will be the largest study of DAFs at the account level ever conducted in the nation. That will do a lot for the entire sector to get a better understanding of how DAFs are actually being used, because with growth numbers like you see on this slide, DAFs have certainly gotten a lot of attention from donors, from nonprofits, from policymakers alike. Finally, before I turn it over to Michael for some additional comments, in the same period of time as nonprofits have grown, we've also kind of seen the sector grow. There's been a growth of what's called a PSO, a philanthropy serving organization, capacity building organizations, regional association of grant makers. You can think of these as the trade associations of the nonprofit sector. Many of the organizations that we have the icons or the logos here on the slide were created in the last 30 years. Over this same period of time, we've also seen major mergers, like GuideStar and the Foundation Center to become Candid. We've also seen some major new entrants, like Giving Tuesday or the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. Both of those organizations started as standalone initiatives and have since kind of matured and become major nonprofits themselves. So before I turn to Michael, just kind of quickly summarizing, we've seen a growth of nonprofits, but at about the same rate as the growth of small businesses across the United States. The mix of nonprofits has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. Many more C3s, many more charitable nonprofits, roughly the same number of private foundations, but a substantial growth in private foundation assets. That growth in private foundation assets has really allowed foundations to increase their share of total giving. At the same time, individual donors are kind of pulling back in terms of number of donors, but those that remain are giving more dollars. And last, kind of sector-wide, we're seeing new tools like other charitable entities, charitable LLCs, donor-advised funds, and the growth of philanthropy serving organizations really come into play as the sector, the nonprofit sector, matures as an industry. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael to kind of give, again, some more color commentary and context around that data picture. Michael.
Yes, thank you very much. Just wanted to start with a couple of comments before getting into some of the specific dynamics I want to talk about from the last 30 years. The first is and I say this at the very beginning of the report, which is 30 years for some fields is not, like geology, for example, is not all that long of time, right? There's not that much dramatic change happening in 30 years, but 30 years in our field, in the field of philanthropy and the study and teaching of philanthropy in particular, is a very long time. And in fact, the amount of change and the pace and size of change in the last 30 years is really historically unprecedented in philanthropy, and certainly in the engagement of researchers and others studying philanthropy and the availability of data. So we live so my first message to you is we live in interesting times, and you're part of this field at a time when it is undergoing dramatic change. And so one of the things we did in the report was to look at what was going on, 30 years ago, roughly, and how has that evolved over time, and what looks different about the field now than back 30 years ago. And unfortunately, one of the things we pointed to here, as you can see, is that it was in 1992 when the Rodney King verdict happened and the civil unrest that happened after that. There's one of those philanthropy serving organizations, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity. They put out a report and have tracked this about the rise in focus and response by funders and by minority-led organizing and nonprofit organizations that really followed that civil unrest and that sort of awakening to a lot of racial inequities in following Rodney King. And of course, then in 2020, we had these things happened continually since then, despite this philanthropic response in local communities and nationally. And then we had the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, which led to yet again another sort of increase in focus on that by foundations and other things. And as you can see, there's other things that are happening right now where it's very clearly a central theme in the world of philanthropy in a way that it really wasn't 30 years ago. It was much more nascent and scattered at that point. You go to any conference in our field, for any foundation conference, any philanthropy and nonprofit conference, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a central topic. And there will be many sessions on that. You read the publications of the field, like the Chronicle or Nonprofit Quarterly, other things, or you read the academic literature. This is a much more significant focus. And in fact, it's brought philanthropy much more into the culture wars, because as you know, DEI, CRT, and all these other dynamics happening currently in the culture war around matters of race, it's bringing philanthropy in the nonprofit sector much more into those culture wars, and we see it happening in the field of philanthropy. There's now a reaction against this strong focus on DEI that's spread across the field now. People talking about, like Philanthropy Roundtable and others, for example, talking about the problems of woke philanthropy and challenging that DEI needs to be as much of a focus of the field as it is. But the field is much more different in that way. Next one looks at the way in which so Pat, if you could move the slide, please. The next one is around some things that were happening in the Clinton-Gore era of 1992. That was the year in which they were elected. And on the campaign trail, they were talking about a number of things. One of them was to emphasize national and community service. And also at the time in universities, there was this beginning of this push. That's how I got my start in the field back in 1987. This push toward service learning programs, student community service programs. When they got into office, they passed national community service legislation, created the Corporation for National Community Service, which continues, and an AmeriCorps program, which some of you might even have been a part of. Those other things happening, like Teach for America was started in 92. So there was a swirl of activity in that time around these issues of community service and national service, and particularly among students and young people. And that has really continued. Those are now sort of very much institutionalized. The Johnson Center started with that as a big part of what our mission was. The other thing that's happening, those have sort of endured. The other thing that was going on back at that time that we've seen fundamentally change the lives, really even more so for all nonprofits, was this push toward that Clinton and Gore called reinventing government, based on, there was a book out called Reinventing the Corporation, and they borrowed it and said, we'll reinvent government. What that meant was, instead of this sort of command and control model of government where, all the taxes goes to the federal government or the state government, and then they decide what they're going to be spent on, and they control and run the programs all from this central location, they said, let's reinvent it. Let's contract out to nonprofits. We see that in the pro-war, the welfare reform, famously, that came up in 96, I believe, during Clinton's terms. And that was very much about contracting those services out rather than having government control those. What that has meant for us in the field, of course, is that government becomes a much more significant funder of nonprofits. Government relies on the nonprofit sector to provide those services that tax money are meant to pay for, and daycare and all sorts of other things, drug treatment, all sorts of things. And it's now a norm that government is a major, major funder. In fact, across the sector, more money comes from government for nonprofit revenues in general than comes from all those sources that Jeff was talking about at the beginning, than philanthropic sources, individual foundation, et cetera. About 1/3 of revenue for nonprofits as a whole comes from government. And that's really been pushed since 92. In these last 30 years, that's a significant change. And it's true even more so in certain fields like human services and other things like that. And so so the sector looks different because of things that were happening starting around that time that are happening now. So another thing that's been changed in the next slide is this sort of focus on measurement and evaluation, this kind of obsession, if you will. And if you're a funder, you probably see it. And certainly if you're a nonprofit, you see that it's getting money from funders that are asking you to be accountable for these numbers. This idea that we've really centered in our field this focus on measuring effectiveness and being accountable for those results that you say you're going to achieve as a nonprofit working towards your theory of change. So this idea that in the past, you would be accountable for sort of output, like how many students went through your tutoring program in your high school, and now you're being held accountable more for, did the graduation rate change? Did the literacy rate in the community in which you had those programs change? Were there actual outcomes and impacts that resulted from that work? And this is very much sort of built into this idea that we think about how we evaluate effectiveness in this sector in a different way now than we really did. And again, another sort of Clinton-Gore initiative that followed from reinventing government was this idea that we're going to build into all government funding for nonprofits logic models, which is now something that's taught in every program, and that when people are becoming nonprofit managers, you learn about logic models, you learn about theories of change, which is a sort of nonprofit version of logic models. The idea is, and the field of evaluation itself has really evolved significantly in the last 30 years to become a widespread profession, and something which many organizations, nonprofits, and funders have now a staff department, maybe one person, maybe many people at the Gates Foundation. It's a whole lot of people doing this kind of evaluation work so that we can make our choices based on information we receive from this clear evaluation. And there's pushback against this, right? And so I should say also, as part of this, funder changes toward this idea that we want more strategic philanthropy. That was a big push for a while. There was venture philanthropy movement, which happened for a while. It's kind of gone away as a term, but it's still around, and it represents the trend, certainly. Effective altruism, which some of you might know what that is, very much centers measuring effectiveness as the way in which funders should make decisions. All of these things have clearly been going on very strongly in the last several decades, but we also see now some pushback against that. We see some the idea that it sometimes delays giving, all that obsession with metrics. It certainly puts burdens on nonprofits in a way that slows their work and makes them do a lot of work maybe that they wouldn't otherwise do, and takes them away from the real program work that they should be doing. So there's been so much pushback against that. It also gives a lot of power to the funders and donors in that historic power imbalance that we know happens in our field. So things like trust-based philanthropy and some things we saw during the pandemic where the reporting requirements were relaxed. There's been some pushback against this, and so certainly we'll see where that goes. But the philanthropic nonprofit world talks so much more about measuring outcomes and effectiveness than it did 30 years ago. Okay, next one, another one, and I often, when I'm talking to students and others, will say that this, for me, is maybe the biggest change, really, that I've seen in the last 30 years, and because I've been in the field that long and a little bit longer, is that these, we talked a little bit about how the boundaries between government and nonprofits and philanthropy have been changing, right, with this increased funding. But the boundaries between business and philanthropy, and deciding what is business really and what is philanthropy, and where does that where do we categorize one thing or the other, has become significantly more blurry in the last 30 years in a way that's really historic, I think. And we're going to look back on this period in the future and say this was a time when we really kind of, in some people's eyes, we're muddying the waters about what is really a nonprofit and what is a business. Other people will say it was a time of tremendous innovation and experimentation that led to amazing things happening because we got away from this kind of siloed thinking that you had to be a philanthropy, you had to work in philanthropy, or you had to work in business, which was in some ways the way that things really had been in the 70s and 80s. There was a little bit in the 80s around, just taking this first one around impact investing. There was a little bit like the divestment movement in South Africa in the 80s, where we said, let's try to force social change by encouraging companies to divest, basically using their financial assets and their investments to force a social outcome. That was fairly unusual at the time. It has now become a much more routine practice. There was, I remember in I think it was 2007, there was this big expose in the LA Times that looked at the Gates Foundation, which had always had this sort of iron wall between the people who did the investments of the endowment, and their job was to make as big a return as they can in whatever they were investing that in, and the people who took the results of that and did the grant making. And the two were not interacting with each other, and that was by design. And but it pointed out that there were many investments that were happening with that massive investment, right? It were billions of dollars were being invested in ways that perhaps were hurting the same causes that the grant making was trying to address. And so, what the right hand of grant making was doing was the opposite, and in fact detrimental to the left hand of the investments. And now you look at foundations, and the Gates Foundation included. Impact investing of their endowments is an absolute central priority and a way that they think about how they meet their mission. And that's true across the sector with many more foundations. And we see it in a lot of other ways, this rise of impact investing. And then a number of these other ones that you see on here have also been dramatically increasing. So corporate social responsibility is in some ways you can't not be socially responsible and be successful as a corporation, especially with millennials as your consumers and others. This idea that corporate social responsibility is a core part of what they teach in MBA schools, and it's very much widespread, and there's a lot of innovation happening about what that looks like. And so and then we see even entities that are forming that are technically business entities, but that have a philanthropic purpose. B corporations is a great example. They have just exploded, and the benefit corporations and some big ones like Patagonia and others are doing things in innovative ways. You might have seen that Patagonia founder recently sort of gave ownership of the company to a private trust nonprofit rather than keeping it as a business. So a lot of things happening in that space. Charitable LLCs, of course, like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the Arnold Ventures, the Emerson Collective, those are all, particularly among billionaires, these mega donors that Jeff talked about, they're choosing not to have a philanthropic foundation, not to do things from a technically nonprofit space, but to have a for-profit entity that does their philanthropic things. So as I said, there's a lot of things happening in that space, and it's very different. You know, we in 1992 you had Ben and Jerry's, you know, and maybe Newman's Own or whatever. They're sort of starting to you know, bring business and give philanthropic purposes to business, but now it's much more widespread. So I think this is a major change. The last thing I'll talk about is around the teaching and research about philanthropy, which has also exploded in the time. So those who are around know that. So back in the 70s, the Filer Commission, which was a federal commission that was sort of convened to, and it really invented this idea that there is this thing called a third sector, a nonprofit sector. You know, in the 50s and 60s, that it wasn't, and before that, it wasn't really a widespread notion that there was this whole sector called the nonprofit sector, called the third sector. The Filer Commission really established that way of thinking, and it also prompted a first wave of research and teaching, but not so much teaching, but research for sure, about how many nonprofits are there in the country? Why do people give? All of those things. And that's then led to, in the 80s, the development of, through independent sector and some other organizations, this development of, let's try to bring the research and teaching of philanthropy into into universities. Let's build up the research capacity about philanthropy, and whether inside the university or outside of it. And there was a lot of funding that started to. They created this group called the Infrastructure Funders, which did a lot of funding of this group. There was a nonprofit sector research fund was started at the Aspen Institute. A lot of things were happening then. And so you can see here in the numbers just how many graduate degrees with a philanthropy related or nonprofit related concentration. From our best numbers, these are probably undercounts, especially the current count. These numbers come from the Seton Hall folks who've been tracking this for many years. From 32 in 1992 to 30 years later, 401, and there's probably even more than those if it's just sort of a single course on nonprofits or whatever. But having said that, there was also some of the biggest centers and some of the earliest centers have now closed. So that, you know, the earliest one that most people point to is Ponpo at Yale. That's now been subsumed into their management school. Case Western Reserve went away. Johns Hopkins recently closed. The Boston College Center for Wealth and Philanthropy closed. So it's not a perfectly rosy picture that there's been this upward trajectory in the way in which we've done research and teaching and philanthropy. And that goes then to the final slide I want to talk to you about, and that is we had these tremendous ambitions to institutionalize the study of nonprofits and philanthropy into the university in the same way that we study business or the same way that we study government, where it's a central part of liberal education. There is a massive amount of research happening. There's many people who learn about this, get a degree in it, and then go work in the sector, or even if they don't work in the sector, they learn about it as part of their, just like you would learn about government in your undergraduate or graduate education. And that has not quite achieved those ambitions that were so acute in 1992. There's still a lot of work to be done around many of the degree programs that we just talked about are fairly marginalized or fairly small, and they're sort of, they're not part of the central educational mission of the university. There's a lot of things we don't know about the behavior that we're trying to study, giving behavior or the nonprofit behavior, like births and deaths of nonprofits, or a lot of other things that we have plenty of research, way more than we did 30 years ago, but there's so much more that we could do to be on par with what we know about how business works or how government works or how the family works or other things like that. So we have tremendous amount of opportunity for new research, and that like we're trying to do here at the Johnson Center. And we need access to data, and the challenge of getting access to data has been a big one over the last 30 years. Just to be able to make that presentation that Jeff made is the result of people pushing for federal legislation to release the 990 forms in a readable format, which is a fairly recent thing. But whereas you can go to a government source and find out, how many blueberries were produced in Michigan in the last quarter very easily, or how many autos were sold, but you can't find out how many nonprofits closed their doors in the last year in a place in a particular state or something. And so there's a lot of work still to be done to get the access to the data we need and to understand the phenomenon of philanthropy nonprofits in the way that we really should. So that's where I'm going to leave you, is this message that we've done so much. The field is so different, but we have a lot more work to do, especially because the field is so much more complicated, as I just talked about, with these blurry boundaries and other things. We need good research that looks at that much more even than we did in the past. And so here's to the future of all that great work. Back to Leslie.
Thank you very much, Michael and Jeff. Much appreciated. I want to share some questions that have been put in the chat. So if we could kind of go back and forth, I'll put this first one to you, Michael. Could you please define what ESG is?
Okay, so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and so those are essentially categories of factors that one can use to assess. Usually, it's assess a business or a potential investment, because beyond the assessment of it purely from financial terms. So you can say, okay, I want to decide whether I'm going to invest in this company, or I'm a company and I want to attract people, or I want them to buy my product. I can report to them what my financial bottom line is, but I also am going to report how our supply chain is using renewable products for an environmental criteria, or we have a women executive advancement initiative for our changing our government, or we're engaged with our community because our corporate social responsibility activities are really massive. And so all of these are other ways of judging the value of a company or an investment beyond just financial. So that's what ESG stands for. It's been around for a while, but it's become much more popular as this impact investing has become more popular. It's also become part of these culture war conversations that I talked about as well, and that we know. So there's a big backlash against ESG because some of the biggest, BlackRock, many people know about BlackRock, sort of this, this massive, the biggest money management entity in the world that owns huge chunks of all the major corporations that you and I know. And they've decided to make ESG a part of all their investment decisions. And there's a lot of pushback against that as part of this woke agenda, this idea that if you judge ESG, you're forcing companies to be something that they shouldn't be, and also that the ESG measurements are just not very accurate. And so this is why Elon Musk hates ESG, for example, because he thinks Tesla should have the highest ESG rating, and Exxon or something ends up with a higher one because of other match. So ESG is very complicated and very controversial, but I don't think it's going away.
Thanks, Michael. Jeff, over to you for a couple of questions, more on the sort of methodology of your data. So the first is about the identification of giving to religious organizations. How did you identify those revenues? Was it through the NTE religion code, or how did you identify what giving to religious organizations is?
We identified them by a very easy way. We did whatever Giving USA did. So that source of data is the Giving USA annual report. And I think it is actually a mix. It's both the NTE codes as well as surveys and raw data that Giving USA gets from providers like Blackbaud, like Charity Navigator, like Giving Tuesday. So it is like many other things, it's an ever-changing definition. One of the challenges whenever we're talking about giving to religion in IRS forms is that technically any house of worship is not required to file with the IRS. So many houses of worship do file because it's easier when they go buy supplies at Office Max or interact kind of with the business sector to have that charitable nonprofit letter with their entity's name on it. But many other religious organizations do not file with the IRS because they're not required to. So it's a mix of both organizational identity as well as survey and raw transaction data that the Giving USA research team has access to.
Thank you. And I think that really reflects, the great research we've done, but also to Michael's point, the needs we still have to do much more robust and detailed research in the sector. Do you have any data or know of any data sets, Jeff, that look at and show a change in overhead and indirect costs? Do we know if those are going up, going down as an overall calculation? Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I've not seen a good study of overhead or indirect costs kind of from two perspectives. One is across a long period of time, meaning like a decade or more. And second is across multiple levels of nonprofits. So there are some fabulous studies out there about, 10 or 50 or 200 organizations. But when your denominator is 1.8 million, there are not studies I'm aware of that really have done that deeper dive into trends in overhead. Part of that will be getting easier. The IRS released, I think in 2015, 990s going back to 2013. So as of today, we have about a decade of 990 data we can start to run that on. In addition, the e-filing requirement that any entity must file their 990 electronically instead of in paper took effect with this last tax year. So we now have in those electronic pools that GuideStar or Candid, Charity Navigator, the Johnson Center that we pull from, we're getting to 100% coverage, but our electronic files back in 2013 were like 8% coverage of the nonprofit sector. So I'm hopeful that over the next 5 years, as Michael talked about, this is an area where there's a lot more research to be done, simply because literally the data is just now becoming available. I'm slightly optimistic that we're in for this like 10 or 20 year period of just nonprofit data renaissance, as these data sets now are of scale enough and accessible enough for research teams to really sink their teeth in and write some good material.
Terrific. And there's a follow-up question on that, which again, may have a similar sort of answer, but is there any sense that funding is more accessible for overhead or indirect costs as foundations are looking at supporting the infrastructure or building the capacity of organizations? Do you see any trends or changes on resource allocation for indirect or overhead costs that you're aware of?
Yeah, so two answers to that. One is, I think as a sector, we're talking about the necessity of indirect costs a lot more now than we were 10 years ago. And a lot of there's a lot of kind of advocacy efforts around that. And I'll let Michael speak to more of that. I'm blocking on the name of the seminal article that came out in the last 10 years that really talked about the need for overhead. But my second answer would be to go back to my very first slide. That red line was sharply up and to the right. So if nonprofits were being starved out in overhead, that line would not be growing so quickly up and to the right. And again, it's mimicking small business. So kind of regardless of the technical answer to is overhead being funded more or less, I can say from an observational standpoint, whatever the answer is doesn't seem to be making a difference in the health of nonprofits because they're growing as quickly as small businesses, which many times don't really have an overhead problem the way nonprofits have an overhead problem in terms of their funding streams.
Thank you. And so this is going to be a big question. I'm going to ask Jeff, you, and Michael, also you, to reflect on this. And so the question talks about, looks at both sides of the coin in the sector. So what gives you sort of hope for the future of philanthropy and the study of philanthropy? And then what are the cautions? What are the worries that you have?
So I have a lot to say on that, but I'll just say also on the overhead thing that there is more, but we still don't have shared definitions of what we mean by overhead and how to measure indirect costs, and there's still, whether you look at organizations like Fund the People or any number of organizations that are really trying to advocate for funders to do more of that, because there is still a lot of funders that engage what one person called the nonprofit starvation cycle and other things where they talk about that, this really continues to be program grants number one, and then sort of, indirects and overheads number two. It's not nearly where we want it to be. The rating agencies have been changing how they, like Better Business Bureau and Charity Navigator and others that are starting to, rate nonprofits differently, not just based on overhead percentage, but we've still got a long way to go. So, but on this idea about hopes for philanthropy and challenges, I'll start with the challenge, and it's because it relates to what I was talking about. I really think that this question of that the dynamics of the blurriness of the boundaries, and this question that just for example, you talk to a young person about who wants to do good in the world, wants to graduate from college and go out and make social change in the direction they want to make it or achieve justice. They don't automatically think that I'm going to go and work for a nonprofit in the way that maybe they used to, or they're, and when you ask people, how do you want to do good in the world, writing a check to a traditional 501c3 nonprofit organization is not at the top of the list like it might have been in the past. And in fact, many of the people, many households have stopped giving to traditional charity. It doesn't mean they're still not trying to do good in the world, but they may be doing it through, or young people might be doing it through conscious consumerism. You know, they're buying products that they know have from companies that have a good ESG rating, or, you know, products that have that, you know, that, like Tom's shoes, buy one, get one model, or other thing, or buy one, give one model, or these other sort of combinations of business and philanthropy, or just businesses that are doing social responsibility activities. I think that's fantastic that businesses are being forced to be more philanthropic and to pay more attention to social responsibility. I'm a massive fan of corporate social responsibility, but I think there's a danger to traditional philanthropy, which in my mind, it still has a massive role to play in our field, an absolutely essential role to play for any society. And there's this danger that we'll start talking about all the ways we do good in the world with business language, or in where we'll sort of discount, because we don't have as much teaching and knowledge, widespread general knowledge about philanthropy. It's easy for us to sort of default over to what we do know a little bit better, which is business language. And I think that's a big danger. I think absolutely the income inequality, wealth concentration, which we've seen dramatically already in our numbers here today, and see it in a lot of other. It's one of the reasons why the middle class and general household giving is down, whereas, you know, the giving by the Mackenzie Scotts of the world has massively gone up. I think that's a real danger, because again, I feel like philanthropy should play a meaningful part in everybody's life and in every community, and no matter whether you have a Mackenzie Scott in that community or not. And I think that's a big worry, is that philanthropy will become even more seen as just for the elites. But that's a negative side. I do think there's a positive. I think there's still the openness to innovation and experimentation, and this idea that we can push back against some of the traditional paradigms that I think is really tremendous for philanthropy, because many of those traditional paradigms kind of ensconced people of power in those positions of power, didn't question whether they should be following the same paradigm that gives them as donors or elites in the field the ability to make all decisions for all people. So I think some of the movements that we're seeing, like trust-based philanthropy or other things that are trying to share power or cede power even to others in the field, and where we're seeing lots of collaborative activities that are happening. Other things which kind of address some core issues that we've really kind of not addressed as much as we should in the past with philanthropy. We have so much more debate about that. It's not always healthy debate. We have so much more debate about that. And I think if we can make that more healthy debate, that's only going to improve the field. And that's a piece of hope that I have for the future.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff, would you like to reflect on that as well?
I'll just briefly add that what makes me optimistic is seeing things like the wider availability of 990 data. And what makes me pessimistic is the still inability to answer the simple question, how many people are employed in the nonprofit sector? So we have come a long way as a sector, and we have a long way to go, as Michael said, to be treated the same as blueberry farmers or auto manufacturers. We are still light years to travel, and it's going to take time.
Thank you. And I think this sort of builds on some of what you've said, Jeff and Michael, what you just shared, which goes to the awareness of nonprofits. Obviously, the sector has grown. We're having webinars, we're having deep conversations. There's a lot of data. There's still more to be done. But the general awareness of nonprofits in the nonprofit sectors is low in the general public. Talk to us or reflect on that, if you would. And Michael, you're nodding, so it looks like you'd like to start. Give us some insights on that and make some sort of connection points and reflections, if you could.
Yeah, I would say that, I was just on an advisory council for a study that came out from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy that looked at this very question. It sort of asked a general audience, the general public, how much they knew about things like what's the payout requirement for private foundations, the 5% that we know. That in the field, most people know that, but not everybody. And a tiny fraction of people know about that. And you ask people to name a foundation, they might be able to name one, or you ask them, to talk about, for example, this question of, if a nonprofit spends 45% of its budget on staff salaries. Is that a good or a bad thing? What might be good or bad about it? How do we judge that? How do we have a conversation about that? There's really not that sort of ability to have that same conversation like you might if you asked, if a business doesn't make a profit for 3 years, is that a good or bad thing? Most people would be able to kind of talk through that a little bit, but nonprofits, the issues around them and the awareness of them is still incredibly low. And I think that's part of the danger. As an educator, I think the solution is always going to be education first, not only, but first. And that's education in this traditional sense of, like we talked about, sort of building in this understanding of philanthropy and charitable work into the core of any liberal education. But it's also, this sort of public education and the ability for people, researchers and centers like the Johnson Center, to be able to, which we are in the Johnson Center particularly good at, of sort of translating what we learned from our research, like, Jeff's amazing work on 990 stuff, translating that in a way that you can communicate that effectively to the general public, or even to, frankly, practitioners in the field. Because, if anybody who's been to a nonprofit degree program, master's degree program, or you've gone to an industry conference, or you've just talked to somebody who just entered a role in nonprofits, there's a lot of misunderstandings about nonprofits and about giving, even among people who have made it their career. And so we've got a lot of work to do in that translational space, I think, to help build that awareness, even before we can try to make it so that your grandmother knows what a donor advised fund is. I'm not sure when that's going to happen, but we got a lot of work to do on that.
Jeff, is there something you'd like to add?
Again, just briefly, I'll steal from the Economist's toolbook and give an on the one hand, on the other hand answer. And that is, on the one hand, if the total dollars to charitable organizations is still rising, if the number of nonprofits is increasing, if nonprofits employ 1 in every 10 American workers, who cares that the public doesn't understand the nonprofit sector? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, when we are in an era of declining trust in government, declining trust in institutions, fraying at the threads of civil society, I care very deeply that members of the public understand the civil society, the nonprofit sector, philanthropic sector. So I think we live in a world where both of these are true, and I think we might need to celebrate as a sector the successes we've had in growing and staying a robust portion of both the American and world economies in the face of, at best ignorance and at worst apathy from many members of the public which we serve. And that's just an interesting space to be in as a sector.
We've got a lot of very interesting and thoughtful questions, but I'm going to, Jeff, give the last one to you because I'm hoping it's relatively quick, because unfortunately we're just at the end of our time together. And this goes, I think, to some methodology in the data that you presented, and it's about community foundations. When you count them, do you count them as one endowment or many different endowments? As you know, community foundations are a conglomerate, so to speak.
Yeah, community foundations are one of the tricky areas in data. They count in the C3 portion of the universe, meaning not in private foundations and not in C other. And we treat the community foundation as a single entity. So we add up all of its pooled funds, all of its assets, et cetera, and treat that as one number. It's only when we dig deeper into individual community foundation kind of balance sheets are we able to separate things out. So the blunt answer is they're marbled into C3s and they're treated as a single number in most cases.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. Thank you for your engagement, for your questions, for sharing where you're from and why you're here and what you do. We appreciate your contributions to the sector. I would like to very much thank my colleagues, Jeff and Michael, for all their hard work and thoughtfulness and for sharing with us the benefits of their research. I'd also very much like to thank our colleagues, Pat Robinson and Tori Martin, who did a tremendous amount of work to put this webinar together. Thank you for joining us. Please sign up for webinars 2 and 3. You can do it at johnsoncentre.org/events. Look for the evaluation soon in your inboxes, as well as for these slides. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.